Between 1966 and 2022, the men on this list were responsible for confirmed that number in the hundreds across 5 countries on 3 continents. They ordered prison guard murders. They burned men alive in the desert. They executed 8 of their own brothers in a barn and left the bodies in a farmer's field. They built criminal empires that outlasted their freedom and, in some cases, outlasted their lives. These are 11 most savage 1%ers in MC history. 1. Wayne Kellerstein. It was 8:30 in the morning on April 8, 2006, when Russ Steele and his wife walked out onto their property outside Shedden, Ontario, and found 4 vehicles sitting in their field that had not been there the night before. 3 cars and a tow truck with no drivers and no movement. Steele tried to look inside one of the vehicles, but a blanket had been pulled across the window. He wrote down the license plate numbers and called the police. When officers arrived and opened those vehicles, they found 8 men stuffed inside, each one shot in the head execution style. Investigators identified 6 of them as full-patch Ontario members of the Bandidos motorcycle club, including their national president, John Musadair, aged 48. The remaining 2 were a prospective member and an associate. As the investigation unfolded, detectives established that all 8 had driven to a farm in Iona Station the previous evening after receiving word of a mandatory church meeting called by their own national sergeant at arms. His name was Wayne Kellerstein, and in the world of 1%er motorcycle clubs, he was exactly the kind of man this list was built for. A former leader of 2 Ontario biker gangs who had spent decades building a reputation for violence so consistent and so extreme that even within a culture that celebrated brutality, his name carried a different kind of weight. By early 2006, the Canadian Bandidos were fracturing from the inside. The Toronto chapter, known as the No Surrender crew, had been ordered by the American leadership in Houston to return their patches and dissolve. They refused. Houston then gave the order to Kellerstein directly: strip the patches from the Toronto members himself or face expulsion. What Houston did not know was that Kellerstein had already decided on a different outcome entirely. The night before the meeting, Kellerstein cleared the farm of anyone who could be a witness. His common-law wife and daughter were sent to stay with friends. The girlfriend of one of his accomplices was sent away too. Once the farm was empty, Kellerstein and the men he had brought from Winnipeg moved through the house, pulling weapons from their hiding places. They cleaned them and loaded them and waited. The Toronto chapter arrived one by one that evening, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they pulled into the driveway on Aberdeen Line. 8 men who had driven out to a rural Ontario farm because their own sergeant-at-arms had called a meeting, and in that world, you did not refuse. As each vehicle arrived, its occupants were directed into the barn. One of the Winnipeg men present that night later told the court that Kellerstein had repeated the same warning to his accomplices throughout the 2 weeks leading up to the massacre. If they killed one, they would have to kill all. So that is what they did. What happened inside that barn was later described in court by a Winnipeg Bandido who had been present that night and turned police informant in exchange for full immunity and witness protection. Known only as MH, he told the court that Kellerstein had stationed an armed accomplice in the barn loft and that the Toronto members were brought to the floor one by one. He testified that one victim had walked toward his killer with his hand extended, trying to shake it before being shot. MH described the sound of the gunfire that followed as popcorn. Each man was taken out of the barn, separately walked to his own vehicle and shot once, in the head inside it. The bodies were then driven 10 miles down the road and left in Steele's field before dawn. Police raided Kellerstein's farm the following afternoon and arrested him without a chase. At his preliminary hearing in January 2007, he gave reporters the finger stuck out his tongue and mouthed a profanity at a courtroom artist. The trial began in London, Ontario in March 2009 and ran for 6 months with testimony from more than 70 witnesses. On October 29, 2009, Kellerstein was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder alongside 5 accomplices who were convicted on the remaining counts. All received life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. 2. Donald Chambers. Before there was a Bandidos empire spanning 22 countries and 5,000 members, there was one man in Texas who decided that every motorcycle club he had ever encountered was too soft. His name was Donald Eugene Chambers, and in 1966, he founded the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in San Leon, Texas. After returning from Vietnam, he did not build the club on brotherhood or loyalty or a shared love of the road. He built it on the understanding that violence was not a last resort. It was the first language of anyone who wanted to be taken seriously in the world he was creating. Chambers was a Marine. He had seen combat and come back from it with the kind of disposition that civilian life has no framework for. The existing motorcycle clubs he encountered after his return struck him as too comfortable, too willing to coexist with a world that had no respect for men like him. So he started his own, and he set the tone from the beginning in a way that nobody who rode with him was ever going to misunderstand. In 1972, drug dealers crossed the Bandidos. The specifics of the dispute have been documented in court records, but the nature of it was straightforward. They had done business with the club, and they had cheated. Chambers had a different response in mind entirely. He took the two men out into the Texas desert, but before he killed them, he made them dig their own graves. Two men on their knees in the dirt under the Texas sun, digging the holes they were about to be put into while Chambers watched. Then he them alive. Chambers was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the template he had established in those first 4 years of the Bandidos' existence did not die with his imprisonment. Every chapter that has ever worn the red and gold has operated in the shadow of what Chambers demonstrated in that desert in 1970. That the Bandidos were not a club that tolerated being crossed. That the consequences of crossing them were not proportionate. That the men who wore that patch had made a decision about how they were going to exist in the world, and it was a decision that left no room for half measures. The Bandidos today have chapters in 22 countries and thousands of patched members across North America, Europe, and Australia. They are one of the 4 largest outlaw motorcycle clubs on Earth. Every one of those chapters traces its lineage back to a man who made 2 drug dealers dig their own graves in the Texas desert and then set them on fire. That is the foundation the Bandidos were built on, and Chambers put it there himself. 3. Yves Apache Trudeau. In the history of organized crime in Canada, there is no individual with a confirmed body count higher than Yves Apache Trudeau. No mob boss, no career hitman, nobody. A Hells Angels motorcycle club member from a chapter outside Montreal, who confessed to 43 murders and who the courts accepted as telling the truth because the evidence supported every single one of them. 43. Trudeau earned his nickname the Mad Bomber not as a figure of speech but as a job description. He worked as a contract simultaneously for the Hells Angels and for the Montreal organized crime world during the period when the two were deeply intertwined in the Quebec drug trade. His preferred methods included explosives, which he deployed with enough regularity and enough precision that the nickname stuck. But bombs were not his only instrument. He killed in whatever way the contract required, and he was reliable enough that both the Angels and the mob kept hiring him. He survived an assassination attempt that would have ended most men. The attempt came from within the organization he was serving, which told everything about the kind of world he was operating in. Rivals wanted him dead not because he was incompetent, but because he was effective enough to be feared by people who should have been on his side. He survived it and kept working. In 1985, Trudeau turned informant. He provided authorities with detailed accounts of his 43 killings in exchange for a dramatically reduced sentence. The man who had more people than most wars produce in a single engagement received a sentence that reflected his cooperation rather than his body count. He was released in 2004 after serving time that worked out to less than a year per murder. But here is where the story becomes something that even the most cynical observer of the criminal justice system struggles to process. In 2017, Yves Apache Trudeau, the man who confessed to 43 murders and walked out of prison after less than 2 decades, was arrested again. Not for anything connected to his decades inside the Hells Angels, not for anything connected to the contracts he had fulfilled for the Montreal mob. He was arrested for assaulting children. The man who 43 people and negotiated his way to freedom had spent his years outside prison becoming a different kind of predator entirely. The justice system that had given him a second chance, through his cooperation, had produced an outcome that nobody in that courtroom in 1985 had anticipated or intended. 43 murders. Released in 2004, arrested for in 2017. That is the full arc of Eve Apache Trudeau. And there is no framework in which any part of it makes sense, except the one that the 1%er world itself provides. In that world, consequences were never proportionate to acts. They were negotiable. And Trudeau spent his entire life proving it. 4. Harry Taco Bowman. In 1984, Harry Bowman became the international president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. He would hold that position for 15 years, and during that time, he would turn the Outlaws into something that the FBI later described as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations operating on American soil. But nobody looking at Bowman from the outside would have guessed any of it. That was precisely the point. Bowman was clean-shaven and well-groomed at a time when outlaw biker culture celebrated the opposite. He wore expensive suits. He sent his children to private schools. He drove an armor-plated Cadillac and maintained dual residency in Michigan and Florida, and kept a rotating cast of girlfriends across the country while running a criminal organization with 30 chapters in the United States and 20 more in 4 other countries. Law enforcement described him as the first businessman biker boss, a man who had one foot in the straight world and one foot in the biker world, and who understood that the straight foot was what kept the other one hidden. From his base in an affluent Detroit suburb, Bowman ran the Outlaws the way a corporation runs its regional offices. Chapter presidents reported to regional presidents who reported to him. The chain of command was clear, and the consequences of breaking it were clearly understood. He escalated the Outlaws' war against the Hells Angels in the Midwest through a campaign of targeted violence that included the bombing of rival clubhouses and the murder of Hells Angels members and associates across multiple states. He ordered kidnappings, he ordered firebombings, he ordered killings, and the men he ordered them from carried them out because the alternative was not something any of them wanted to find out about firsthand. In 1991, Bowman made a move that almost got him killed from an entirely different direction. The Outlaws began extorting Lebanese racketeers in Detroit, who had traditionally paid protection money to the Detroit Mafia. When the mob found out, they put a contract on Bowman's life. 2 Mafia enforcers were assigned to kill him and were caught on an FBI wiretap discussing the murder plot as they drove past his house. In one of the more extraordinary moments in American organized crime history, the FBI then met Bowman in a Detroit parking lot to warn him that the Mafia wanted him dead. The agents had to convince him they were not setting him up. Bowman absorbed the information, negotiated a sit-down between himself and the Detroit mob leadership, and walked away from the meeting alive and with an increased share of the criminal profits. The man the government was trying to prosecute had just used the government's intelligence to survive a mob hit. But the federal case against him kept building. In 1997, Bowman was indicted on 10 counts, including RICO violations, drug trafficking explosives charges, and illegal firearm possession. The FBI raided his residence but could not serve the indictment in time. Bowman disappeared into a network of outlaws' safe houses across the country. In March 1998, his photograph went up in post offices across the United States as number 453 on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list, with a $50,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. He stayed hidden for 15 months, moving between safe houses while his deputies ran the club in his name. In June 1999, he made a single visit to see his family at their home in Sterling Heights, Michigan. The FBI was waiting. He was arrested without incident. The trial ran for 12 weeks in Tampa, Florida. Former outlaws testified against him, describing how they had blown up rival clubhouses and thrown delinquent club members off motel balconies. By the time the jury returned its verdict, Bowman had been convicted of racketeering conspiracy to murder, drug trafficking, and firearms offenses connected to crimes spanning nearly 2 decades of his presidency. He received 2 life sentences plus 83 years. The indictment had noted that his notoriety in biker circles rivaled that of Sonny Barger. Barger built the Hells Angels into a global empire and died at 83, surrounded by 7,000 mourners. Bowman built the Outlaws into a feared international criminal organization and died in federal prison on March 3, 2019, having never spent a free day outside after his arrest. 5. Maurice "Mum" Boucher. There is a specific kind of ruthlessness that separates the men who use violence to protect criminal operations from the men who use violence to attack the systems designed to stop them. Most organized crime figures fall into the first category. They kill rivals, they kill informants, they kill people who have crossed them in ways the criminal world recognizes as legitimate grounds for retaliation. Maurice "Mum" Boucher belonged to the second category, and the decision that placed him there was one of the most audacious acts of criminal aggression in Canadian history. In the summer of 1997, Boucher ordered the murders of 2 Quebec prison guards, men who went to work every morning in a uniform and came home to their families at night. Diane Levine was shot and killed on June 26, 1997, as she drove home from her shift at the Rivière des Prairies Detention Center. Pierre Rondeau was shot dead on September 8, 1997, on a prison transport bus. A second guard survived the same attack with serious injuries. Both killings were carried out by Hells Angels prospects acting on Boucher's direct instructions. The calculation behind the order was specific and cold. Boucher was not killing these people out of rage or impulse. He was making a strategic decision about how to reshape the environment in which the Quebec justice system operated. If prison guards could be murdered on their way home from work, then every person connected to the processing of criminal cases in Quebec had reason to be afraid. Witnesses would be more reluctant. Guards would be less willing to testify. The machinery of justice would slow down. And in that slower, more cautious environment, Boucher and the Quebec Hells Angels would have more room to operate. But the strategy collapsed in the face of its own audacity. The murders did not intimidate the Quebec justice system into paralysis. They produced the opposite reaction. The scale and directness of the attack generated a law enforcement response of an intensity the Hells Angels had not previously faced in the province. Boucher was arrested and charged with ordering the killings. His first trial in 1998 ended in acquittal. The jury found him not guilty and he walked out of the courthouse free. The public reaction was immediate and sustained. Protests outside the courthouse, political crisis inside the Quebec government. The acquittal was appealed on the grounds of misdirection by the trial judge, and a new trial was ordered. In 2002, Boucher was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But conviction did not remove him from power immediately. The organization he had built was structured to function with its leadership behind bars, and Boucher continued directing operations from his cell for years after sentencing. It took sustained and deliberate effort from correctional authorities to isolate him sufficiently to interrupt his ability to run the Quebec Hells Angels from inside a prison cell. Boucher had come to the Hells Angels from poverty and spent his career building an organization that by the height of the Quebec Biker War was responsible for over 160 deaths. The war he helped engineer between the Hells Angels and the Rock Machine was not a conflict between 2 clubs fighting over a street corner. It was a sustained campaign for control of the Quebec drug market that consumed a decade and left bodies across the province, including the 11-year-old boy Daniel Desrochers, 1995, when a car bomb planted by Angels associates detonated as he walked past it in a Montreal parking lot. The prison guards he ordered killed in 1997 had nothing to do with that war. They were a message. 6. Mick Howie. On the morning of March 22, 2009, a Qantas flight from Melbourne to Sydney landed at Sydney Airport, carrying 2 groups of men who should never have been on the same plane. On one side were senior members of the Hells Angels, including their Guildford chapter president, Derek Wainohu. On the other side were members of the Comancheros, including their national president, Mahmoud Mick Howie. The 2 clubs had been at war for months. Every man on that flight knew exactly who was sitting around him, and by the time the plane began its descent, both sides had their phones out sending messages to the ground. The backup was already on its way to the terminal before the wheels touched down. Howie had become national president of the Comancheros in 2003 at the age of 22. He had taken over a club that was still rebuilding after the Milpera massacre of 1984 had effectively destroyed its original leadership and turned it into something new. Under Howie, the Comancheros abandoned whatever remained of their old identity and rebuilt around a younger, more aggressive membership drawn heavily from Sydney's western suburbs. The club that had once been founded by a Scottish immigrant with a military background was now being run by a 22-year-old from Lebanese background who had no interest in the traditions of the organization he had inherited. He had interest in territory, in markets, in the kind of dominance that required rivals to understand the consequences of pushing back. The Hells Angels had been pushing back, the months leading up to the airport. Confrontation had produced a series of escalating incidents between the two clubs. Clubhouse firebombings, drive-by shootings, a kneecapping at a bike show in Silverwater. Both sides understood that the tension was going to break at some point. What nobody anticipated was that it would break in the departures hall of the busiest domestic terminal in the country in front of hundreds of witnesses, including families with children. The flight landed at 1:30 in the afternoon. As passengers pushed through the terminal, a Comanchero looked at Wainohu and said words that witnesses would later repeat in court. "Come on, boys, let's go." What followed lasted approximately 30 seconds. Steel bollards were ripped from the floor and swung as weapons. Men punched and kicked each other through the terminal while passengers scattered. At the center of it, Anthony Zervas, 29 years old, and the brother of Hells Angels member Peter Zervas went down. He was struck over the head with a metal pole, with what a police statement described as significant force. His brother Peter dropped beside him. Anthony Zervas died on the terminal floor. He was not a patched member of any club. He was the brother of one. Howie was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to a minimum of 21 years. His legal team appealed, and the conviction was later reduced to manslaughter with a non-parole period of 7 years. He was released on parole in 2015. 3 years later, on February 14, 2018, Howie was sitting in his Mercedes in the car park of a gym in Rockdale, Sydney, when someone shot him dead. Nobody has been charged with his murder. The man who had become national president of the Comancheros at 22 and had led the confrontation that killed a man in Australia's busiest airport and had served 6 years of a murder sentence before walking free, was shot dead in a gym car park on Valentine's Day at the age of 37. The Comancheros he had built kept operating. The Hells Angels he had gone to war with kept operating, and whoever pulled the trigger in that Rockdale car park has never been identified. 7. Anthony Snodgrass Spencer. Every war needs a trigger. The war that produced the Father's Day massacre of 1984 had one of the most mundane triggers in the history of outlaw motorcycle club violence. A club president caught in a compromising position with a member's wife, a disciplinary hearing that never happened, a walkout, and a man named Anthony Snodgrass Spencer who took what should have been an internal club dispute and turned it into the bloodiest single day in Australian biker history. Spencer was not supposed to be the kind of man who started wars. He was born in Tamworth, New South Wales, into circumstances that gave him nothing to work with. His mother committed suicide when he was a child. His father was absent. He grew up moving between foster homes and institutions in Sydney, where at the age of 11 boys at an Anglican boys' home held his head underwater, in a bathtub, in an unsuccessful attempt to drown him. The incident left him with a lifelong terror of water. He was barely literate throughout his life and kept a diary full of spelling mistakes from adolescence until the night before he died. He joined the Royal Australian Navy at 17 in what his diary suggested was an attempt to conquer his fear. He was discharged dishonorably. When he joined the Comanchero Motorcycle Club shortly afterward under founder Jock Ross, he found the first thing that had ever felt like a family. He lied about his military service to get in claiming combat experience in Vietnam that he never had. He was so desperate to belong that he fabricated an entire history to make himself worthy of membership. Ross became, in Spencer's own written words, the father he had never had. But in late 1983, that surrogate family shattered. Members of the club caught Ross in a compromising position with the wife of a fellow Comanchero, as Sergeant-at-Arms Spencer supported bringing disciplinary charges against Ross. Ross refused to appear at 2 consecutive hearings, and at the third simply announced the club would split into 2 chapters and walked out. Spencer and the Campbell brothers remained at the Birch Grove clubhouse. Ross and his loyalists set up a new clubhouse in Harris Park. The split was personal before it was organizational, and it never stopped being personal. Spencer had visited Bandidos chapters in the United States 2 years earlier and had been impressed by the respect shown to him. He contacted Bandidos National President Ronnie Hodge and received approval to convert his Birch Grove chapter into the first Australian Bandidos chapter. The new members burned their Comanchero colors in a ceremonial fire. The act was designed to be final and to be seen. It was a declaration as much as a resignation. By August 1984, the 2 clubs had declared war on each other by telephone. Spencer and Ross spoke directly. The call ended with war confirmed. Both clubs fortified their clubhouses and armed their members. An advertisement for a motorcycle swap meet at the Viking Tavern in Milpera on September 2, 1984, became the date both sides circled. Father's Day in Australia falls on the first Sunday of September. On September 2, 1984, families were inside the Viking Tavern watching the Blues Brothers on the bar television when the Comancheros arrived in the car park. 19 of them, heavily armed, taking up positions and waiting. 20 minutes later, 34 Bandidos arrived, including Spencer and the Campbell brothers. What followed lasted 10 minutes. Shotguns, a Rossi .357 Magnum rifle, baseball bats, 6 bikers killed, and a 14-year-old girl named Leanne Walters who had come to the swap meet because she loved motorcycles hit in the face by a stray bullet and the car park. Spencer did not fire a single shot. He stayed in his car throughout the entire battle. When it was over and the dead were counted, he got out to help pull away the wounded. That night he broke down in tears, telling his girlfriend they killed us. Shadow and Chop are dead. They wanted to kill us. He had declared the war. He had organized the side that fought it. And when the shooting started, he sat in his car. The club members he had led into that car park labeled him a coward before his trial even began. Charged with constructive murder, Spencer was taken to Parklea Prison to await proceedings. But Spencer never stood trial. On April 28, 1985, he was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself. His lawyer later said that on the afternoon before his death, he had been late to a clinic appointment to collect prescribed sedatives that helped him sleep. The pills were denied because he was late. That night he used the belt from his trousers. The boy who had grown up in foster homes and institutions and had held his head underwater as a child and had lied about his military service to join a club that felt like a family had, started a war that killed 7 people and changed Australian gun laws permanently. And he died in a prison cell before he could answer for any of it. 8. Francesco Cisco Lenti. In the world of Ontario outlaw biker clubs, Francesco Cisco Lenti occupied a position that was unusual even by the standards of a world built on unusual men. He had worn the colors of nearly half a dozen clubs over 2 decades. The Satan's Choice, the Rebels, the Bandidos, the Loners, which he founded himself. The journalist Yves Lavigne described him in 1999 as the social butterfly of the biker underworld, the temperamental Lenti who flitted from gang to gang when he did not get his way. His colleagues in the Ontario biker world called him the Velcro biker. The patches kept coming off and going back on somewhere else, but the nickname that sounded like a joke concealed something that nobody who had ever stood across from Lenti in a confrontation found funny. He had a habit in fights that set him apart from men who settled disputes with fists or weapons. Lenti gouged out the eyes of his enemies, not as a last resort, not in the chaos of a brawl where anything might happen. Deliberately, The journalist Peter Edwards, who covered the Ontario biker world for the Toronto Star, wrote that no one could count on coming out on top in a fight with Lenty, and that guys who went toe-to-toe with the veteran biker sometimes came away with one less functioning eye. That reputation was not rumor. It was documented enough that it became part of how the Ontario biker world understood who he was and what engaging with him meant. Lenty was born in 1947 in Woodbridge, Ontario, to Italian immigrant parents. He founded the Loners Motorcycle Club and built it into one of the more significant outlaw clubs in Ontario before his restlessness took him elsewhere. He had friendships with several figures from the Ontario Mafia, including members of the Musitano family of Hamilton. He was never a made member of any organized crime family, but he moved in those circles comfortably enough that the line between the biker world and the mob world was not always visible in his story. In December 2006, a confrontation took place in the lobby of Club Pro Adult Entertainment in Toronto between Lenty and David "Dread" Buchanan, the sergeant-at-arms of the Hells Angels West Toronto chapter. Buchanan punched Lenty. Lenty drew a gun and shot him. Buchanan died from the wound. A second Hells Angels member present was also shot and wounded. But here is what made the incident different from the dozens of similar confrontations that had taken place in the Ontario biker world over the preceding decades. Lenty had chosen that location deliberately. He later told Detective Angelo De Lorenzi that he had gone to the lobby of Club Pro specifically to have the confrontation recorded by the security cameras. He was not looking for trouble, he said. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the record to show that Buchanan had thrown the first punch. In a world where disputes were settled in back rooms and parking lots, away from any camera, Lenty had staged his confrontation in front of one. Several Hells Angels contacted Lenty's family after the shooting and said that Buchanan had been out of line and that his killing was justified given that Lenty had only fired after being struck first. The Angels' national secretary was reported to have said that up until the shooting he had a good relationship with Lenty and that Lenty had once saved his life. Lenty turned himself into police the following day. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of Buchanan and to aggravated assault for the wounding of the second Angels member. He received a 6-year sentence. 6 years for a killing that his victim's own organization described as justified. For a man whose reputation for gouging out eyes had kept the Ontario biker world cautious around him for decades. For the founder of the Loners MC, who had worn the colors of half a dozen clubs and survived every one of the transitions that switching sides in that world normally produced. 9. Mark Leroy Denklau. The Gypsy Jokers Motorcycle Club has operated in the Pacific Northwest of the United States since the 1950s. They are not the largest outlaw motorcycle club in America. They are not the most internationally recognized. But the ATF and the FBI have maintained consistent surveillance on their Oregon chapters for decades, because the Gypsy Jokers have produced a specific kind of violence that stands apart from the drug trafficking and territory disputes that define most one-percenter criminal activity, the kind that happens inside the organization, to the people who were supposed to be protected by it. Mark Leroy Denklau was the president of the Portland, Oregon chapter. In 2015, a former club member robbed someone connected to the Gypsy Jokers. In the outlaw motorcycle club world, that kind of transgression has a predictable set of responses: a beating, a warning, an enforced repayment. What Denklau chose instead was something that prosecutors would later struggle to describe in language that adequately conveyed what had actually happened to the victim. The former member was kidnapped. What followed over the course of his captivity was described by federal prosecutors as medieval-level brutality. The details that emerged during the trial were specific enough that the judge presiding over the case made particular note of the severity of what had been done. The victim was tortured. Then he was murdered. The body was disposed of in a manner designed to prevent discovery. Denklau was arrested and charged under federal RICO statutes that allowed prosecutors to frame the killing not as an isolated act of violence by an individual, but as an expression of the Gypsy Jokers' organizational culture and the club's systematic use of violence to enforce its rules and protect its interests. That framing was significant because it meant that the full weight of the federal racketeering apparatus was directed not just at what Denklau had done, but at what the club he led had enabled and sanctioned. The trial produced testimony that reconstructed what had happened to the victim in enough detail that several jurors requested breaks during the most graphic portions of the evidence. Dan Clow was convicted of racketeering and murder. In 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. But the Denklau case did not end with a single conviction, because Denklau had not acted alone. 10. Chad Leroy Erickson. Chad Leroy Erickson was sentenced alongside Mark Leroy Denklau for his role in the same 2015 kidnapping, torture, and murder of the former Gypsy Jokers member in Portland, Oregon. But Erickson's presence in the case added a dimension that made the prosecution more significant than a single chapter president, acting on his own authority. 2 senior members of the same chapter, both present, both participating, both convicted. That detail matters because it collapsed the defense that organizations often rely on when a single member commits an act of extreme violence. The argument that one man went too far, that the leadership did not sanction it, that the club cannot be held responsible for what one person decided to do in the heat of a dispute. With Erickson convicted alongside Denklau, that argument was not available. 2 of the most senior figures in the Portland chapter had been present at what prosecutors described as a planned and deliberate act of extreme violence, carried out against a former member who had violated the club's code. The joint prosecution under RICO was built on exactly that reality. Federal prosecutors argued that what happened to the victim in 2015 was not the spontaneous act of 2 angry men, but the expression of an organizational culture that had been documented across the Gypsy Jokers' decades of operation in the Pacific Northwest. A culture in which the club's response to internal transgression was violence, and in which that violence was carried out not by rogue individuals, but by the chapter's own leadership acting in their official capacity. Erickson was convicted on the same charges as Denklau, racketeering and murder. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole, alongside his chapter president in 2022. What the Denklau and Erickson convictions produced together was something that individual prosecutions rarely achieve. A documented institutional record of a chapter's leadership deciding together that what happened to that former member was an appropriate response to what he had done. 2 men, 1 decision, 1 victim, 2 life sentences, and a federal case file that will be used to prosecute Gypsy Jokers members for decades to come. 11. Pastor Fausto Palafox. On September 23, 2011, the annual Street Vibrations Motorcycle Festival was underway in Sparks, Nevada. Thousands of riders had gathered in the city for what was, by all appearances, a celebration of motorcycle culture. Inside the Nugget Hotel and Casino that evening, members of 2 clubs who had been circling each other for months found themselves in the same room. Members of the Vagos Motorcycle Club on one side, members of the Hells Angels on the other. What happened next lasted seconds. Jeffrey Pettigrew, the president of the Hells Angels San Jose, California chapter, was shot dead inside the casino. Terrified patrons dove behind slot machines and scrambled for exits as gunfire erupted in the middle of a crowded hotel casino floor. 1 Vagos member was also shot and wounded in the exchange. By the time security arrived, Pettigrew was dead, and the men responsible were already moving toward the exits. The shooting looked in the immediate aftermath like a spontaneous confrontation between 2 rival clubs that had gotten out of hand. But federal investigators who spent the next 6 years building a case around it concluded that what happened inside the Nugget Casino that night was not spontaneous at all. It was sanctioned, and the man who sanctioned it, according to federal prosecutors, was Pastor Fausto Palafox, the international president of the Vagos Motorcycle Club. Palafox had led the Vagos through a period of aggressive expansion that had taken the club from its California and Nevada base into Hawaii, Oregon, Arizona, and beyond, into at least 7 countries across 4 continents. Under his leadership, the Vagos had grown to nearly 90 chapters, with the majority concentrated in California and Nevada. The club that federal prosecutors described in their indictment was a closed society whose members valued allegiance above all else, exhibited a complete disdain for the rules of society, and kept witnesses in a state of permanent fear through acts and threats of violence that made cooperation with law enforcement a more dangerous option than silence. Prosecutors alleged that Palafox had given the green light for the Pettigrew killing before it happened, that the shooting inside the Nugget Casino was not a fight that escalated, but an operation that was authorized at the top of the Vagos organizational structure, that the international president of the club had looked at the situation developing between the Vagos and the Hells Angels in Nevada and decided that Pettigrew needed to die. In June 2017, a federal indictment was unsealed charging Palafox and 22 other Vagos members and associates with conspiracy to participate in racketeering murder robbery, kidnapping, and aggravated assault across a criminal conspiracy that prosecutors said had been running for more than a decade, spanning California, Arizona, Hawaii, Oregon, and Nevada. Palafox was arrested at his home in Beaumont, California, as part of coordinated raids that simultaneously hit targets in 3 states and Hawaii. But the case that followed was not straightforward. The government star witness, a former Vagos member named Gary Rudnick, admitted during trial proceedings that he had fabricated key portions of his testimony, including his account of Palafox giving the explicit green light to kill Pettigrew. The admission sent the prosecution into a crisis. Defense attorneys argued that the entire case had been built on lies and that their clients were being prosecuted for a shooting that the evidence showed was a spontaneous act of self-defense rather than a premeditated assassination authorized by the club's international leadership. The trial ran for months in Las Vegas federal court. The outcome remained contested at multiple stages of the proceedings. Palafox and his co-defendants faced the possibility of life in prison on the racketeering and murder charges. What the Palafox case captured, regardless of its ultimate outcome, was something specific about how the most senior levels of outlaw motorcycle club leadership operated in the 21st century. Not with chains and leather in a parking lot, with organizational structures and chain of command decisions and international expansion strategies that looked more like corporate governance than criminality, until someone ended up dead on a casino floor in Nevada, and the federal government spent 6 years trying to trace the order back to the man at the top. Every man on this list wore a patch that said he answered to nobody. The court said otherwise. But before any of them wore that patch, one man decided what it meant and what it would cost to wear it. Click the next video to find out who built the world these men lived and died in.